Welcome to the Wellness Spotlight.
Hi, Ken. Thanks for having me here.
Alan, tell me, what was it that made you become a psychologist?
I think I'm one of the few people that can say that I've wanted to be a psychologist ever since I was a young adolescent. I had friends who were struggling with things like depression, and I found myself being very empathic, and people were just drawn to speaking to me about some of their difficulties, and I found it very gratifying, and it kind of went from there.
And could you tell us the difference between being a psychologist and being a psychiatrist?
Okay, well, they're really very different. Psychiatrist is a medical doctor, a physician, who specializes in psychiatric conditions, mental illnesses, in the same way that a cardiologist would specialize in heart conditions. Psychologist is not a medical professional, but is trained as a therapist.
And could you tell us a little bit about where you studied?
Well, I got my doctorate from Rutgers University, right around the corner here. But I got my master's degree up in Fairleigh Dickinson in Madison, and my undergraduate degree at Cortland State University, which is a SUNY school in upstate New York.
Alan, you know, no matter where you look today, it seems like people are explaining so much about what's going wrong with their life based upon stress. Do we have more stress now than people had years ago than, say, our grandparents had? Or does it just seem like we have more?
It's hard to know for sure, but I guess I would say that the stress is really very different. It's less about are we going to get food on the table and working long, hard days, although that for sure happens plenty as well. But I think that we live a very, very fast-paced life compared to our grandparents or most of our grandparents. And that's extremely stressful for very many people.
How do you define stress?
Basically, it's a reaction to things in our world, in our lives, or even our own thoughts that result in some elevated emotional and physiological response. Sometimes it's good because it's the thing that gets us out of bed in the morning and gets us going and allows us to do well in school or do well on the job. But if it gets out of hand and becomes too much, then it starts working against us.
Can you give me some examples about what you would call good stress as compared to stress that could be potentially harmful?
All right, well, let's say I'm working in a business and I know that I have an important presentations to make the next day at work. I'm going to have a certain amount of stress because of that, but that's going to motivate me to prepare to really know my stuff to work well. If, on the other hand, I'm going to be doing a presentation in front of what I expect to be a very hostile audience, and that if I don't do a good enough job, I might get fired, that might end up creating so much stress that I end up not being able to concentrate or not sleeping well the night before, and I end up not doing as well as I might have done otherwise.
You make a distinction between fear and anxiety. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I see, and there's not a complete consensus about this, Ken. I mean, people have different ideas about what these terms mean, and a lot of times they're used interchangeably. But the way that I see it, anxiety is more of a chronic condition. I have a lot of anxiety over a course of a long period of time, whereas fear is a very acute reaction to a very specific situation. So I might be anxious in general about driving, but I have a specific fear reaction when I'm on the road in the moment in a particular situation.
Now, how do these things affect a person? I mean, aside from the obvious mental consequences, physiologically, what do fear and anxiety do to a person?
Well, this is a concept that a lot of people have learned back in high school called the fight or flight response, which essentially means that our bodies react in a way that allows us to either fight back whatever physical threat, and this goes way back in time.
Come around the corner, you see a saber-toothed tiger,
right.
Your body gets in motion, so you're ready to fight it, or
run away.
Run right up a tree.
Right. And so everything that happens to us when we experience anxiety or fear is really designed to help us better run or fight. So we breathe more quickly, so we get more oxygen into our bodies, and our hearts pump more quickly, so that the blood is able to take that oxygen to different parts of our bodies more quickly. Our digestive system essentially shuts down because at a certain level our body says, well, digestion is important, but not right now. We have an emergency situation, and so we're going to focus everything on things like thinking as quickly as possible and moving those large muscle groups as much as possible. So the blood vessels also constrict, they tighten up around the surface of our skin, because we don't need small finger dexterity when a saber-toothed tiger is breathing down our necks, which is why sometimes our hands will get cold, but our face or head will get flushed. And a whole host of different hormonal and neurological and muscular changes take place.
The adrenals kick in.
Right, the pupils dilate so that you can see, but the hearing becomes more acute. You perspire for several reasons. One, because you know, when your body is wet and you feel a cool breeze, it cools your body because evaporation is a cooling process. So it's like throwing cold water on a hot engine to make sure that it doesn't overheat. It also is more difficult to grab something when it's very wet and slippery. And so if an animal was after you 30,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago, if you were, you know, sweaty, it would be harder for it to grab a hold of you. So everything really is designed for that level of survival.
Okay, but now we don't have saber-toothed tigers running around East Brunswick anymore. So years ago, we'd see the tiger, we'd have our reaction, and we'd either get eaten, so the problem would go away, or we'd run away, and eventually the tiger would go away, so the problem would go away. But now, we're confronted with all kinds of things to make our lives stressful. We are concerned about being able to make ends meet in the economy. We see the fluctuations in the stock market and wonder whether or not our retirement is going to be there. We are concerned about being able to raise children in a healthy environment so they grow up to be upstanding citizens, and on and on and on. So it seems like the fear may have a tendency of not going away, you know, or the anxiety may not go away. What's the long-term effect of this?
Well, a lot of people who have this problem, where they have a lot of anxiety for chronic periods of time, can easily tell you that often there's a breakdown in the system. The fight or flight response was designed to be an emergency response, a short-lived response, and then there's a time afterwards for recovery. But if you're sitting in traffic jams for 2 hours every single day, day after day after day, and then you're worried about what's going to be happening at work all day long, and then you come home and you have to deal with the bills, and it's just on and on and on like that, there tends to be a breakdown. And people experience all kinds of symptoms, such as chronic headaches, stomach problems, muscle aches and pains, and also difficulties in changing certain aspects of their activities of daily living. So they may eat too much or not eat enough, or sleep too much or not sleep enough, irritability, poor concentration. These are the kinds of things that begin to tell us that the anxiety is taking its toll, and we really have to do something about it.
And then that can bleed into all aspects of their life, either on their own body and their own health, on their ability to be able to perform at their best, to be able to be as productive as they could be, or the quality of their relationships.
Absolutely.
I would figure. So what is it about different people that cause them to respond in different ways? Because you could have two people that are subjected to the same kinds of stresses, and yet one person would be fearful and anxious, and the other person, it rolls off their back like water off a duck.
All right, well, I'll give you a little Psychology 101 here, and you know, I'm executive director at the Stress and Anxiety Services of New Jersey, and there we practice cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a very specific kind of therapy, and a lot of the focus there is on cognitions, which is just a fancy word for thoughts, thinking, and the idea there basically is the way we think about something has profound implications for how we respond physiologically and emotionally, and so it's really the thinking process, the way that we think about something, as opposed to the thing itself, that will make us anxious. That's why you can have two people in the very same circumstance, and one reacts calmly, and the other reacts more negatively or overreacts. One person says, I can handle this will be okay, or there's really nothing I can do about this right now, I need to just kind of move on. And the other person will just sort of bang his or her head against the wall saying, this can't be happening, I can't let this happen, I have to do something, even when there really isn't very much that they can do about it.
What determines how a person reacts the way that they do, Alan? Is it genetic? Is a person's reaction to circumstances something that's pre-programmed in, or is it something that they learned growing up?
The $10 million question. The short answer to that is, well, we really don't know. But it's clear that both of those components play a role, that whole nature and nurture controversy. The problem is if I grew up in a household where my parents are both, very calm and tend to be very thoughtful and react slowly to things in terms of their emotional reactivity, well, if I'm the same way, how do I know if that's because they modeled it for me and I learned that way, or because somehow they genetically transferred?